I teach this social movements class, and I noticed when I started teaching this class in the early 2000s, there's a lot of interest in LGBTQ politics and identity, but very little knowledge about gender and sexuality, or even really about any movements for racial, sexual, or gender justice. Students just hadn't learned very much at all about progressive movements for social change, either in high school or in other college classes. And it was also a time, I'd say, in the early part of the new millennium where there was a lot of interest among students in activism, but not a lot of sense of how to do that. And I think of this for myself too, that I grew up in the 80s, and I remember sort of looking wistfully back at the movements of the 60s and 70s and feeling like they had kind of passed me by. And our students at that time were very interested in thinking through that question of how do I become an activist? How do I participate in social change? I think now in this particular moment, there are a lot of people just interested in understanding how we can move the country forward, and this set of movements can teach us a lot.
Can you give us some examples of that?
So there's, for me, a set of really compelling examples for how people in the LGBTQ community and their allies have created social change that have to do with, one, a focus on legal civil rights, but two, I think there are all kinds of other things that activists and advocates for LGBTQ social change have done, including building alternative communities around arts and religion and music and family structure. And then to me, the art and pop culture realm is really compelling. I do feel like art and popular culture have just been such an important part of moving hearts and minds and of organizing communities. And I think in this movement, back to the pre-Stonewall days of the 1950s, when what we called the homophile movement in the early 50s, where people were meeting in secret and circulating early publications that were all about building a community and visibility, but that were being shared in secret and under pseudonyms. And those were a really important part of building these early communities for people who weren't out in their daily lives. To everything to Rent, which was, for me, in the 1990s, just a really important moment and rallying cry, to just all of that we've seen in pop culture and television and film, and especially television.
No doubt for many young people today, and I would imagine your NYU students amongst them, the LGBTQ movement sort of begins and ends with the fight for marriage equality. But in your estimation, what remains undone? What do we have yet to achieve and remain vigilant of?
Well, it's interesting. I think I would have given a slightly different answer a couple of years ago for a number of reasons. One, I think the young people I know now who are just starting college actually have grown up in a time where marriage, while potentially not nationally available, was always on their radar as something that was possible for same-sex couples. Didn't necessarily think of that as the primary fight, although I do think that it's still there as the predominant mainstream issue over the last couple of years. But I think with the election of Trump and the direction we see the country now, I don't think that we can even count on marriage equality as being something we can take for granted. So I think we're seeing it back on the table, and it's, I think, very precarious right now. But I think in terms of what to do beyond marriage, I think there was a big conversation in the mainstream LGBTQ civil rights movement about this in 2015 after the Supreme Court Obergefell decision. And part of that focus was just on civil rights. So on making sure that the laws were broader than just the protection of marriage. It's still not federally protected. And so even just passing federal non-discrimination laws and federal equal access laws. So, what people said after the marriage decision passed was you could get married on Sunday and fired on Monday. And that's really still true in a lot of states where we don't have state or local protections against job discrimination and housing discrimination. And then I think just like we see with any civil rights movement, there's legal change and then there's cultural and social change. And we see this still with civil rights around race, that we had major legislation passed in the 60s protecting equal accommodation and voting rights, and we still see significant segregation and significant racial discrimination in many institutions. And I would say the same is true for LGBTQ equality. We need to fight for broad legal rights and protections. We also have a lot of work to do to ensure full social and cultural equality.
We've been listening to Lisa Stulberg, author of LGBTQ Social Movements. Thank you for listening.